Welcome back after the coffee break. My name is Stephanie Irlbacher-Fox. I'm the moderator for this session, Plenary 6, Human Security, Gendered Aspects. So we have three speakers today and then two panelists. Our first speaker is Gunhild Hoogensen Gjørv, who I first met in about the mid-1990s when I was a master's student and she was doing a PhD at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. So it's always lovely to see Gunhild, who I've known for quite a long time now. She's a full professor of political science with a specialization in international relations at the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway, and she's a research associate at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. She's involved in a number of research projects focusing on extractive industries, particularly social and economic impacts. Gunhild writes a lot about international relations theory, security in the Arctic, and military civil interaction. And she's written extensively on the topic of feminism, gender, and security. She's the author and the editor of a number of books, and her talk today is called Gendering Human Security in the Arctic. Welcome, Gunhild.
Thank you very much, and gosh, what a nice intro. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about gendering security. My papers don't want to stay on here because, you know, they're wrinkled. I had wrinkled them up. I'm going to start with actually an experience I had a couple of days ago. I was just need that a little bit higher up there. I was in Toronto at the Transatlantic Science Forum, I think it's, or Science Week it was called, and they had a bunch of side conferences. So I attended one on the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. And I find this very interesting because it's taking a look at security issues in a little bit more of a so-called traditional way, largely along borders. And the issue of security, what is security, this came up. And I'm one, as I will explain a little bit further shortly, I'm one who is very much a proponent of looking at security, and I'll get into what I mean by security, from the bottom up, that is inclusive. And what was interesting was when I was arguing for that the Coast Guard needs to have this kind of an inclusive understanding of security, that when they're operating, even with regards to search and rescue efforts, that their security picture should not just be about borders and state security, but also local communities. I was met with a bit of a, well, actually a smug response. And I kid you not, it was said, security is for the big boys. And to me, that says it all. What they were arguing, in a sense, not in a sense, what they were arguing was that security is a concept that is exclusive. Not everybody is in on this. Security is only about the state. And it's only about those actors that are allowed into this concept by the state. It's an elite concept. And these elites decide who's in and who's out. Now, the rationale here is that security, it's about state survival, right? So, security has been employed, particularly during the Cold War, particularly in the 20th century, but particularly reified under I'm saying particularly a lot, under the Cold War, that security was about a military exercise, or that the state is protecting itself with military means. That's it. That's that box. That's what security is. So it makes it, boom, narrow, exclusive. There's only a few actors who it's relevant to. And the assumption is that when security is understood this way, it is done so because the state is number one. The state, this thing that is the government, the territory, and the population, and this notion of sovereignty, if we're going to use, like a standard definition of the state, that's the thing we have to secure the most, because if the state doesn't exist, well then, it just doesn't matter anymore. Then the security of anything else really doesn't matter because the state is number one. Now, the thing is, when you buy into this, and it's really easy to buy into this, let me tell you, particularly in my field is a field of big boys. It's getting less and less like that, but studying security studies is the area, the territory of the big boys in a way. And there's a lot of women who are vying to be the big boys. And what do I mean by that? Because there's a lot of power, there's a lot of pressure to buy into this notion that security is supposed to be only about the state, only the military, only the means, using military means to secure the state. And it's very easy and it's understandable. And this was happening at this particular conference I was at, where others were kind of like, yeah, okay, well, you know, that's right. When we're talking about anything else, we're talking about well-being or safety and stuff like that, and we won't touch you guys in your security. You know, we'll buy into that, and that's fine, because actually there's a lot of people who will get really good grants, research grants and stuff, if they buy into that. It's a very powerful discourse, and then there's me and some others who are saying, no, well, we're not going to buy into this powerful discourse. Not necessarily because, well, maybe because we're idiots or something, but no, but it's a very difficult discourse to work against, and but at the same time, I have a problem with this idea that survival, the ultimate thing to survive, has to be the state. Because we actually see in reality, you know, when we're observing reality, yeah, there are these things called failed states, or which we international relations people call failed states, but there's still, people are thriving. Well, they're maybe not thriving, they're surviving. Some are not surviving, but life continues in a way. Actually, the state is not integral to the survival of other actors, so to speak. The state is an actor, but it's not always integral to that. Secondly, we have failed states, but we should also talk about the failure of states. The failure of states to provide security, if the assumption is that a state is providing security to its contents, that would be us. We are the contents of a state. But it fails to do so. What then? Then what we see are actually other non-state actors that play a role in trying to provide a form of security for a particular group of people, a particular region, and what have you. So you see that this notion of security is operationalized on multiple levels, even though there is this very powerful discourse of saying security can only be about the state, and it's the use of the military to protect that state. I might say the other side is that there's a lot of people who reject the term security because of its close association with the military. So when one starts talking about security, it's like, whoa, you know, I don't want to talk about that. We reject that concept because it is about the military. And it does. It has a lot of baggage, this particular concept. It has a lot of baggage from particularly the Cold War. There's that word again, particularly. But it is, because the notion of security has a long history. It's a historical concept. And at its root, it's actually about the freedom of caring, or freedom from caring, that you don't have to worry about certain things for your survival. That's taken care of in one shape or form, and then you have this thing called security. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be about the state. And actually, it hasn't been about the state. That concept was a concept in and of itself, just about whatever type of actor you might be talking about, that it's this sense of a freedom from caring, or having to care that, or being worried. Another thing is that when we think about the failure of states, insofar as states have a role to play, and insofar as other actors, let's say people like ourselves, have been relevant to state security, often the state, in its drive to provide itself with security, has made other actors insecure. And as an example, we can take a look at the extermination of populations have been done in the name of state security. The assimilation of populations have also been done in the name of state security. We also see that states have relied on unpaid labor, on certain family formations to generate a certain economic type of system. That is also in the name of state security, in the sense that the state has to thrive, and we assume that unpaid labor is going to play a role in that. State security has also been employed in ways where you have military dominance over civilians. It could be either within the same state or from one state over to another. Or even the argument for state security has been the exclusion of women in the military, if we want to take the other side, where women are told they can't be in the military because state security. We won't be as secure with women being in the military. So, in fact, this notion of state security, in a way you can see why people would reject the notion of security, because it's kind of nasty at times. It has not been friendly towards people, average, normal, hopefully normal, folks like us. At the end of the Cold War, there was this, well, even before the end of the Cold War, this notion of state security, particularly employed by militaries, was being challenged because it wasn't meeting the reality on the ground. In part, environmental security was being developed through the 1980s, the notion of this notion of survival. Well, our survival may rely in part on that a state maintains its particular structures, its boundaries and whatnot. But let's think our survival also relies on the environment, very much on the environment. In the beginning, the environment was being talked about in terms of, the ways in which we can best exploit the environment over a long period of time so that we always have this opportunity. But over time also, environmental security has been articulated in ways that the environment itself should be preserved, not for exploitation, not for what Audrey was talking about, conquering, right? Yesterday she was talking about conquering nature, not just from a conquering nature perspective, but actually being a part of nature, having a place in that whole sort of framework, an entire global ecosystem. So we've already been challenging this notion of state security. And one challenge came forward after the Cold War, at the development of this concept called human security, which isn't necessarily new, but it got popularized in the 1990s, particularly in the UNDP report from 1994 entitled Human Security. And here it was acknowledged that, in fact, even when states do have security, groups of people may not be secure. And we should probably acknowledge this finally. This would be regarding the failure of states, not just failed states, but their failures. And so the assumption was that we're going to look at security from a, pardon me, from the position of the individual rather than the state. It's a very liberal kind of a, concept, this human security, or its roots, at least framed in this particular way, has very sort of liberal types of origins, where the individual now stands in the place of the state, and that we're interested in identifying issues of security or insecurity at the individual level. I should also say, just broadly speaking, so security is about freedom from a fear or freedom from care, but also it has a time dimension on it. It has a time and a value dimension on it, which is related to states, but is also related to any other actors. And that is that security is about the things that we value most, in a sense we prioritize most, and it can be material or immaterial, but those things we cherish so much, we want to see those things continue into the future, and we link those things to our survival. And that could be the environment, that we cherish that so much, and it's so much linked to our survival, that is something we want to see go into the future. And that would be then environmental security, because it's like the number one issue. It could be identity, something also called in the Human Security Development Report, or the Human Development Report, a sense of identity, community. So like ethnicity would be relevant here. Who we are is fundamental to our survival, and that needs to continue into the future. So that's the sort of picture of security, or that's what security is about, and that's how we start to think about what are the issue areas, that the things that we feel should be continued into the future, that's fundamental to our survival. So in this report, it's acknowledged that the environment is relevant to that feeling of survival. Personal security, so physical security, obviously, well, hopefully obviously. Political, and that is engagement in our societies. Economic, food security, health security, and again, identity or community security. Human security was largely defined as freedom from fear and freedom from want in 1994. And I mean, needless to say, that sounds kind of very, very big. And it's been criticized a lot for being kind of like a hodgepodge of everything. You can just sort of like pack as much as you want into that particular concept. Ooh, I'm getting the yellow card. Then I will speed up. The difficulty with this concept is that it was designed in such a way as to be employed by the northern states largely, like Canada and Norway that fronted this concept, and exported to the south. So that means Canadians and Norwegians could just sort of like poke around the world and go, things are not so good for you there, and we'll help out. We identify insecurity and we solve the problem, largely. This I termed in the book that Stephanie has contributed to, and Environmental and Human Security in the Arctic, as virtuous imperialism. And that's how it was employed. As a way of being, it's a wonderful thing, but we're still having this sort of like a dominance over others. There's no sort of democratic voice here. There's a marginalization of other voices. Which brings me to the gendering aspect. Gendering, I've been working on the human security concept because there's something about it that security is for the use of other actors. It is not exclusive for the state. And in fact, the state needs competition, where this idea of prioritizing values for the future. It cannot be relegated to a small elite that determines how to use particularly military devices to secure areas. So the state needs competition, and in that sense, it means opening up the space for other voices. And this is where a lot of the work in gender and security and feminist security studies has been very fruitful in human security. And you see it, and not just myself, but there's many scholars who've been working at this, who are also attracted to the notion of human security and its relevance, but looking at it in such a way that it opens up space, it democratizes the notion of security. It makes visible these voices, and it makes visible needs for survival that are not necessarily relegated to the state. Then just my final words, why the Arctic then? Part of that virtuous imperialism was the assumption that difficulties or insecurity is something only for the global north. In a way, aid organizations, that's how this is operating, right? We've seen that as well. But yet, as has been already said during this conference, there are many the fundamental survival of certain people throughout the Arctic, different contexts, of course, but their fundamental survival has been threatened in various ways, not least including identity, but also economic, that their survival is threatened because of large rates of poverty, toxins in the Arctic, and toxins impacting foods in the Arctic have a very strong impact on food security and identity security when certain communities rely on certain food products to continue the traditions that are fundamental to their being, and they want to continue this to the future. So it is relevant to the Arctic. And now I'm getting the red card. So yeah, it's to just have the conversation opened up and give the state competition about what we think is the most fundamental to our existence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gunhild. Our next speaker is Jack Hicks. Jack is well known as being associated with Nunavut, the newest Canadian territory. He was the director of research for the Nunavut Implementation Commission, which was responsible for setting up the Nunavut government. And when Nunavut was created in 1999, he became the new government's first director of evaluation and statistics. In 2004, he left that position. He's been focusing since then on suicide prevention, and he's been involved in a study related to that, and has also been the suicide prevention advisor to the government of Nunavut, and worked with a number of partners to develop the Nunavut suicide prevention strategy. Currently, he's teaching in child studies at Carleton University, and he's completing his PhD at the University of Greenland, looking at the social determinants of elevated rates of suicide behavior by youth in Nunavut. So his presentation today is titled Unresolved Historical Trauma as a Threat to Human Security in Nunavut, Gender Aspects and Other Aspects. Welcome, Jack.
So I'd really like to thank the conference organizers for the invitation. This has been a really great event and a really great banquet last night. It had never occurred to me that one could make skyr creme brulee. I was blown away. So these three teenage girls are from Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut. And while they have their happy moments, the fact is they have suffered a lot more trauma in their lives than teenagers anywhere should have to deal with, including the suicides of friends, the suicides of parents, and in at least one case, their own suicide attempt. So Canada doesn't like to talk much about the social realities of Nunavut. When the Prime Minister goes north every summer, it's happy picture time. He's skidoos and military and sovereignty. And now the Franklin ship obsession. Very strange, the Franklin ship obsession. I think the Prime Minister's obsession with the Franklin ships is because Franklin was such a pioneer in the field of non-evidence-based decision-making. But Nunavut is now 15 years old, and frankly, the social situation is getting worse, as you can see here. You have a segment of Canada where 41% of adults report having experienced severe sexual abuse during childhood, extremely high rates of violence against women and children, sexual violence against children, homicide, crowded housing, deep poverty, and a society which is self-medicating on weed to a staggering degree. And if you think about it, at this moment in the evolution of things in Canada and the Arctic, the job of the territorial government is to prepare a healthy, educated workforce, but it's failing to do that. And I would argue the two main reasons are, one, they don't focus clearly on the well-being of children, which is what's required in this situation. And historically, they don't look at the social situation in terms of a mental health crisis. Clearly focused mental health crisis. There are moments of clarity on this, including the Inuit organization NTI. Every year issues the State of Inuit Culture and Society report, and they're starting, as you can see here, to put pieces together and focus on mental health as the underlying factor in a lot of our negative outcomes. The suicide situation has not gotten better, it's gotten worse. Last year was our worst year ever. This man, a Iqaluit city councilor, lost his son. And while this year is better than last year so far, we have had a number of very young suicides, including an 11-year-old, which rocked the territory pretty badly. So that's the overall picture going back to the early 70s of the suicide rate for Inuit and Nunavut compared to that of all Canadians. And we see a pattern not unlike what happened in Greenland some years earlier, stabilizing at a rate of about 110 per 100,000, which is 10, 11 times the national average. And it is structured highly by sex. So we see, and age. So we see really, really high rates among young men, elevated rates among young women as well, tapering off over the life course. And I don't mean this, if we had data on suicide ideation and suicide attempts, it would probably show that, like most countries in the world, women attempt suicide more often than men do, but men complete more often than women do because they use more lethal means and have more clear wish to die. I would suggest that the concept that's necessary to understand what's unique in Nunavut is historical trauma. that Nunavut has all the things that every other society has in the world that causes a tiny section of the population to find themselves at such distress that they think about ending their lives, but also Nunavut has a lot of historical trauma. So historical trauma is not the same thing as post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not a psychiatric diagnosis. It's not individual level. It's a collective phenomenon. And it's cumulative and intergenerational in its aspects. So this is critically important. I have heard voices over the year in Greenland and in Canada suggesting it's a damaged generation. It's very sad what they went through. As they age out, the situation will resolve itself. The situation is not resolving itself. The situation is being passed on to children. The concept didn't exist in Inuktitut, but this is the translation that we use in Nunavut that works for people. We find it makes sense. Trauma experienced by generations past having an effect in their descendants. So to the degree that there's an official Inuit history, modern social history in Nunavut, it's this timeline developed by the Inuit College Nunavut Siva Niksavut. So the vertical axis is Inuit autonomy, and then you have time. So before the arrival of Europeans, Inuit were in a highly autonomous society. Then there were a series of what are called disruptions, bringing autonomy to its lowest level in the late 1960s, ethno-political mobilization, Inuit organizations, creation of Nunavut. I would suggest I should note, the pattern and the intensity of these disruptions varies in different parts of Nunavut. Not all Inuit in Nunavut experienced everything, the same way, same time. The critical source of trauma in the society, I would argue, is relocation into communities in the manner in which it happened, especially in the Kikitani region. And there are good academic writings about this. There are several good works. This is probably the most famous, David Damas. But as a Chinese scholar writing about the history of the Americans in the Philippines suggested, these are white people's histories. They don't tell the story from the Inuit perspective. To the degree that there isn't an Inuit narrative, it comes from a remarkable body, understudied, I would suggest, called the Kikitani Truth Commission. The fellow just to the right of the camera is a retired Inuit judge from Labrador. He went around the region. The initial goal was to record stories about the killing of sled dogs, but he quickly realized there was a lot of other traumas that people wanted to talk about. So among his conclusions was that the government of Canada should formally acknowledge that a lot of the social problems we see in the region today are in part symptoms of intergenerational trauma caused by historical wrongs. Probably won't be surprised if you know anything about the government of Canada these days that this is not up for discussion and no action has been taken. When we created the Nunavut Suicide Prevention Strategy, we suggested that understanding the role that historical trauma has played doesn't excuse people who do things to children or to their partners, and it doesn't mean we can blame one entity, because as is said elsewhere, everything the state did, it did with the best of intentions at the time. However, understanding historical trauma and how it is transmitted intergenerationally is an imperative first step in breaking the cycle in Nunavut. If we're going to intervene, we have to know what it is we're intervening about. There's been a remarkable failure of political and bureaucratic leadership on suicide prevention in Nunavut. Not a single politician can be claimed to be a champion in the way that arguably Asig Kamnitsnaruk was in Greenland. Legions of well-paid bureaucrats have made sure it wasn't their responsibility to take action, and the Inuit leadership itself has failed to press the point. There have been some bright spots. We should note that actually Nunavut is a very Canadian jurisdiction in this sense, because Canada is one of the few developed countries in the world not to have a national suicide prevention strategy. However, Quebec, which takes a different approach to social problems, has implemented a provincial suicide prevention strategy and has cut its youth suicide rate in half in a decade. It's a global success story. I mean, isn't that remarkable? In 10 years. unknown in English Canada. Nobody knows this. Critical point was made by Upaluk Popel from Greenland at the UNPFII in 2005 that, like, how can we explain that these rates are so high and nothing, very little is being done? So I want to present some data that shows that while all this nonsense is happening at the political level, there's something else happening. There are 25 communities in Nunavut. The biggest circle in the sort of the middle left is the capital, Iqaluit. 25 communities. Turns out, so this is based on 15 years of data, 434 deaths by suicide, 350 men, 84 women. Turns out that if you do the math for the Inuit populations of the communities, there's an incredible variation at the community level. This is not in common knowledge in Nunavut yet. So the red communities are the higher rate communities. They're almost all found in the Kikitani region, which I would argue has the most intense social anger resulting from the way in which people were coerced into communities by the federal government. In the mainland, the Kivalliq area, the Kitikmeot region, there was a higher degree of movement was voluntary for wage labor or rescue from starvation. That has a different impact on the community than people living autonomous lives in SEAL camps in the Kikitani region and being coerced by the state in the 60s, 70s, right up to the 80s. Men became very angry about what had happened. It was men's lives that were the most ruptured, men's sense of self-esteem. There's also Kugluktuk in the far west. It has its own trauma history, which I won't go into now, but those are the higher suicide rate communities. However, because of its different characteristics, I'm going to take Iqaluit out. So Iqaluit is there, so the red is now the highest rate communities, blue are the lower rates, and Iqaluit's in the middle. So what's different about the structure of suicides in those communities? So those are now the high rate communities. Those are the low rate communities. And note that Nunavut's worst residential school experience was the Catholic mission school at Chesterfield Inlet. In the box, you have the largely Catholic communities where men, they're now adult men who were they were students there, they were often physically and sexually abused. They're not among our highest suicide rate communities because there are other, not that we haven't experienced suicides among residential school survivors, definitely we have, but what's happening in the Baffin and Kugluktuk reflects the fact there are other types of intense trauma that have played out in the society. It isn't just about residential schools. So if you take the higher suicide rate communities and we just look at the males, because thankfully there aren't enough women suicides to disaggregate in this manner, we see an absolutely shocking rate of teenage suicide, pushing 1,000 per 100,000. And when we add in the lower rate communities, we see that while the higher rate communities are higher over the life course, really the difference is in the much higher rate of teenage male suicide, which I would suggest speaks to the greater intensity of historical trauma. But when we add in Iqaluit, we see something very interesting. There's a lot of middle-aged people dying by suicide in Iqaluit, often with alcohol. Those people who haven't found happiness, haven't found a partner, go out to the bars, go home, carry on drinking. There's not a lot of alcohol in suicides outside of Iqaluit, but there is in Iqaluit. But note, in the 15 years since Nunavut was created, no 10 to 14-year-old, and for Nunavut, a relatively low rate of suicide among 15 to 19-year-old males. So Iqaluit is a red community, but with a lower teenage rate. So how do we're social scientists. When we have data, we have to try and figure out what it means. So I would suggest that there are social forces at work that have given Iqaluit this lower rate of death by suicide among teenage Inuit boys than in the smaller communities. Interestingly, this is not a one-off. Peter Bjergård has shown the same thing has happened in Greenland among Inuit young men living in Nuuk compared to the rest of the country. And Matt Berman has documented the same thing for the cities in Alaska. So the safest place to be a teenage boy in Inuit societies is in the biggest urban centers. How do we explain that? So in addition to what suicide prevention people normally talk about, the kind of activities we try and put in place, we need to understand the social determinants which underlie what appears to be a wider epidemiological transition. Why young men in the cities are somewhat less at risk than young men in the smaller communities. Could it be about a more coherent life script for young boys, that life makes more sense? You had a historical Inuit male role model and way of being a boy watching your dad, and there's a modern wage economy coherent life script, and that the problem are the folks who haven't made the transition from one to another. Perhaps there are more positive role models in young boys' lives in Iqaluit. Perhaps there's just more to do. More people. If you have a relationship breakup, it doesn't have quite the intensity as it does in the smaller community because there are other, kids your age. Perhaps stronger public services, early childhood programs, better schools and social services. As weak as they may be in Iqaluit, they're stronger than they are in the smaller communities. Perhaps to a certain degree, it's about improved living conditions broadly defined. And perhaps it's essentially about boys having more hope for the future in Iqaluit than in smaller communities. So I was part of a study, a 5-year study, which thoroughly documented the risk factors for suicide in Nunavut. It's in the International Journal of Circumpolar Health. It's free, you can look it up. We looked at all 120 deaths by suicide in a 4-year period. So we know what the risk factors are. But I would suggest that we need to start researching protective factors in a different way than resilience research does. I'm not so interested in how, in a very difficult situation, some young people manage to survive. It's an interesting question. What I want to know is, at a societal level, at a social level, at a community level, what's happening in the bigger cities compared to a lot of the smaller towns. And I'm not assuming that men and women and boys and girls have experienced the historical trauma in Nunavut the same way, or that the interventions required to help them lead happier lives are the same. But I think it needs to be part of a new research agenda. We know what the risks are, what's behind this positive social change. And I don't get to talk about these things in a positive way very often, so I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you for listening. Do you know how to turn this off? I don't know how to turn this off. He knows how to turn this off.
Thank you very much for that, Jack. Not a whole lot of positive stuff coming out of Northern Canada, it seems. It's been interesting. Our next speaker is Valur Ingimundarson, hope I pronounced that correctly, who is Professor of Contemporary History at the University of Iceland, where he's also the chair of the Center of Excellence in Critical Contemporary Research. He has written extensively scholarly works on Arctic governance, geopolitics, U.S.-Icelandic relations, Icelandic foreign security, and Arctic policies, among other things. He's had several posts at other universities, including as a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and the Paris-based École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. He has a number of relevant publications to this conference with respect to the Arctic Council and the politics of Arctic governance. And most recently, he's published a book with Cambridge University Press, Arctic Security in an Age of Climate Change. So his talk today is entitled Recasting Sovereign Rationalities, Gendered Visions, Human Security, and Arctic Geopolitics. Welcome, Valur.
Yes, what I would like to do in this talk is to discuss a bit the interaction between gender representation, security, and geopolitics. And I will pick up some of the themes developed earlier by Gunhild and also Auður about the state and gendered definitions or representations of the Arctic. Gender theorists have used discourse and spatial analysis and the concept of human security with its emphasis on individuals and communities to question open and latent power structures, masculine narratives, and dominant security discourses. The purpose is to counter the dominance of state-centered approaches and to recast a geopolitical agenda by prioritizing societal concerns, including gender-based violence and the empowerment of marginalized groups. Such critical engagements have not managed to displace state-based sovereignty discourses or to end their predominance, but they can be useful as a tool to deconstruct the prevalent geopolitical and security structures of the Arctic, which are made up of intricate and unequal power relationships. They can also point to sites associated with the production of sovereign power through the construction of subjects and territories. Human bodies are locations where sovereign power operates unevenly. The very term sovereignty draws on the power invested in one body, that of the sovereign, and the body lies at the center of ambiguities about jurisdiction, mobility, and territorial control. And as a topic, it can facilitate analysis that are attentive to nationality, ethnicity, gender, and other axes of difference. Such gender approaches can also be complemented with other concepts, such as hunting or spectrality, to use Jacques Derrida's term, to account for the endurance of past masculine rationalities that reinforce power constellations in the present, including past colonial discourses of Arctic exploration, science and exploitation, and Cold War militarism. Instead of disappearing, such paradigms have undergone a transformation, having lost the capacity to act as officially sanctioned and hegemonic narratives. The old patterns linger on and survive, if in different forms, and they can be revived. Here I juxtapose such gender and human security approaches against the predominant realist and liberal frameworks to explore the power structures at work in Arctic geopolitics. Expressions of power emerge, as noted, in part through the debates about jurisdiction and control of territory, about who governs a site, polices its border, and regulates mobility in the form of entry and exclusion. The legitimacy of the current framework for integration and governance in the Arctic is based on the UN Law of the Sea Convention, UNCLOS, and the most influential regional intergovernmental forum, the Arctic Council, which has been open to various national and transnational influences exercised by actors such as Arctic indigenous peoples, non-Arctic states, and intergovernmental, interparliamentary, and non-governmental organizations. Yet the 5 Arctic littoral states, which make territorial claims in the Arctic Ocean proper, and the 3 additional Arctic states, the 3 is Iceland, Finland, and Sweden, which make up the Arctic Council, have carved out a hegemonic role based on sovereign rights and regional presence. While there is no area hegemony in the Arctic, the multilateral dominant framework is based on various types of open and latent hierarchies, reflecting the disparities between stakeholders, between the Arctic 5 and the Arctic 3, between the Arctic 8 and the indigenous populations, and between the Arctic Council states and the observers. The geopolitics of the Arctic have produced what has been termed an uneasy synthesis between liberalism, with its emphasis on possibilities of cooperation through regimes, and realism, with its preoccupation with states and national security interests. As Klaus Dodds and others have argued, the reopening of the Arctic from the confines of Cold War spatial orderings was read during the 1990s as an opportunity to establish a new political cooperative order based on Western norms, together with concepts of sustainability, demilitarization, and human security. On the other, The Arctic was defined in terms of the resurgence of realism in the 21st century, as geopolitical actors allegedly scrambled to re-territorialize an opening Arctic space in pursuit of national security interest and resource competition. To be sure, a spate of media accounts on the scramble of the Arctic and the potential for great power rivalry, which were buttressed by interventionists of neo-realist scholars following the Russian North Pole flag-planting spectacle in 2007, were replaced by government and scholarly narratives on neoliberal regional cooperation. But today, the tension between the West and Russia over the Ukrainian civil war has already affected Arctic cooperation and has raised the specter of great power rivalry in the region. Actually, an incremental securitization had already been taking place in the Arctic in the last few years. It has not been about projecting power over the region as a whole. The increased military capabilities of the Arctic states are generally limited to forces and equipment for policing national territories and territorial waters. In short, the present situation is characterized by ambiguities inherent in the dichotomies between cooperation and conflict, and between state sovereignty and international regimes. What is clear is that the state-centric discourse continues to set the agenda in the Arctic. This is not to say that post-Cold War widening of the security concept, which underpinned the notion of human security in the 1990s, has been discarded even among actors and institutions involved in traditional military security. There is recognition that security should not be confined to the military domain, but include other areas, such as social and economic protection. Human security, as Gunhild pointed out, is based on the universalist notion that vulnerable people should be provided with freedom from fear and want. But as a Western construct, the concept is certainly not free of historical, genealogical, or political baggage. It should not come as a surprise that realist and liberal scholars should have rejected it. After all, it is meant to challenge the shared epistemological assumptions about the anarchic nature of the international system. It has also been contested on the grounds that it covers too much ground, that it can obscure the relationship between individuals and social groups, and that it can undermine human rights regimes that are predicated on individual rights. Finally, human security has also been associated with what has been termed humanitarian militarism. The UN adoption of the responsibility to protect doctrine in 2005, affirming that each individual state has the responsibility to protect its population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, was meant to establish a clearer code of conduct for international intervention, advocating a greater reliance on non-military measures. In practice, however, the concept has run the risk of rationalizing military interventions and regime change in the name of human rights protection. Despite these caveats, the human security paradigm provides a different reading of security and draws attention to those sidestepped by geopolitics and its gender representations. In the case of the Arctic, for example, it reflects pressure to give Arctic indigenous peoples more of a say in Arctic governance and to acknowledge the input of external actors on the grounds that the global impact of the ecological transformation taking place in the Arctic due to climate change goes way beyond narrow traditional state and regional interests. Indeed, this phrase, scramble for the Arctic, has been used as a warning against past ideologies or colonial or imperial pasts and the need for maintaining a cooperative order in the Arctic. But again, as it turns out, Arctic meta-narratives are being developed with more than a hint of imperial nostalgia and made up of disparate, if interrelated, histories and reification of heroism. A return to 19th century great power politics, a romanticized ideology of a true North identity, exalting a frontier mentality based on desires to colonize a space in the name of sovereignty, and recycled Cold War discourses and practices such as bomber flights in the Arctic. When read as a gendered space to be won over, as Auður was mentioning yesterday, by masculine exploits, the openness of the region is what characterizes and to which is so central to Arctic geopolitical performativity. In an exhortation to the US political class, published in a much-quoted article in Foreign Affairs in 2008, to abandon its neglect of the Arctic and to assume a global leadership role to prevent the region from erupting in an armed mad dash for its resources, Scott Borgerson used a nostalgic frontier narrative, Go North, Young Men, as a way of drawing on a specifically male-bonding American settler experience. This historical reference was meant to rekindle the spirit of a daring and youthful masculine excitement, plus the subtextual lure of personal enrichment associated with the participation in a pioneering project. Thus, the Arctic was portrayed in the same way as the colonization of the American West, as an aspiring and noble cause for young men. This narrative, of course, glossed over the fact that minorities were oppressed by the migration movement, and in its contemporary reworking, there are predictably no mentioning of the people who live in the Arctic. But this evocation of the past, the colonial spectre or hunting, is a stark reminder of the continued relevance of such discourses in the imagination of realist commentators on the Arctic. Similarly, in a recent intervention by a realist scholar, celebratory Cold War schemes are projected onto the Arctic in an assessment of its future strategic developments. According to this reading, an Arctic Spring has the potential to transform the Arctic basin much like the Prague Spring, promised to open up and integrate Czechoslovakia with the West. The hope it expressed, he continues, while temporarily crushed in 1968, was realized with the Velvet Revolution of 1989. Such far-fetched analogies admittedly look more amusing than serious, but again, they attest to the endurance of Cold War ghosts and metaphors in the present. At the same time, it's possible for the major Arctic stakeholding states to state ritualistic disclaimers against a new great game and the need for international cooperation and rules and regulation over Arctic jurisdiction and access to natural resources, primarily oil and gas. The Arctic terrain itself makes it also an area where overlapping territorial claims and different readings of access to transpolar routes can coexist without leading to an open conflict between states. In other words, there's an inbuilt logic and rationality within this conflict cooperation paradigm. What is clear is that sovereign power is making concerted efforts to preserve its privileged position in the Arctic. The workings of the Arctic Council are a case in point, that the 8 Arctic states, for example, did not even discuss the applications of NGOs and other international organizations for observerships in the Arctic Council at the Kiruna ministerial meeting in 2013, when those of China and other Asian states and Italy were approved, is a case, shows this. The parties have surely opened up space for regional cooperation through the non-traditional proceedings of the Arctic Council, where a variety of state and non-state and scientific actors have a voice. But the Arctic Council, as a soft law forum, is controlled by the Arctic states through intergovernmentalism. The existing Arctic power disparities and arrangements do not alter the fact that global civil society, such as indigenous peoples' organizations and environmental NGOs, have legitimate regional or trans-regional interest in the Arctic that differ from those of states. The political order, however, rests on the notion that traditional sovereignty discourses and state behavior trumps over the sovereign interest and human security of individuals and groups. To be sure, there is no need to deny or to bracket the state or to create a simple state-society binary. After all, the state has an important role in societal security and human security. But the purpose is to question its reified and overarching position. What gender and human security interventions can do is thus to disturb the state-centric rationalities of geopolitics by pointing to alternative sites where gendered Arctic identities, subjectivities, and insecurities are negotiated. And to conclude on this notion of subversion, Aretha van Herk has played with the masculinist inscription of the North in her work Places Far from Ellesmere, to recast it as a feminine space. She mocks the patriarchal assumption regarding the Arctic, and in her imagination, it's a space equated with women, but denied to women. Or as she puts it, terror of women, terror of the North. Such reimaginings can lead to the reproduction of stereotypical gender territorial visions. But what is more important is that the narrative is also about unsettled boundaries, fluid environments, non-state social formation. And in the end, it's about envisioning an alternative model to the predominant territorial state. Thanks.
Thank you, Valur, and thank you to all our speakers. And we have a couple of panelists. So what I'd like to do is invite our speakers and panelists to the front. And the panelists we have include Søren Stach Nielsen. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And I'll just quickly introduce them while people are getting settled. Søren Stach Nielsen served as Deputy Minister of Research for the Ministry of Housing, Nature and Environment in Greenland. And prior to that was at the Premier's office, where he served as a director for several years. He has facilitated talking circles and men's groups for a number of years in Nuuk, where he worked with the local community on several projects. And from the beginning of 2014, he's become the director of the Greenlandic House in Aalborg in northern Denmark. Gunn-Britt Retter is our other panelist, and unfortunately I don't have a copy of her biography in front of me. And although Jan and I at the beginning of the session agreed that she really needs no introduction, Gunn-Britt Retter, I hope you could maybe give us a couple of sentences introducing yourself and perhaps your affiliation. So we'll start with having the two panelists give opening remarks, and then we will open it up to questions. So I guess we'll begin with Stach.
Who? Me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Søren, and believe me, this is not difficult to sit here and talk about men's group, because it's a very private part of me. I have never been speaking about my involvement in men's group. I have never been giving a speech about what we talked about in the men's group, how I joined them. So. Being a former director, a deputy minister, this is quite a private part of me, which is quite difficult to talk about. It's much more easy to have an angry government pointing at me, why haven't you done your job, instead of sitting here and talk about men's group. Anyway, I'm here. I would like to speak a little bit about my involvement in men's group. I have a practical experience with running men's group. I've been running men's group for 5 years, from 2002, 3, and then 5 years ahead. My path of my involvement in men's group started many, many years ago. I grew up in Nuuk, in the capital of Greenland. My parents chose that I should attend a Danish-speaking school, so I went to a Danish-speaking class for 10 years. So I never became a part of the Greenlandic groups because I went to a Danish school. I never became a part of the Danish group because the way I look, because I'm Greenlandic. So speaking about the colonized mind, I know about the colonized mind. I've been thriving with it, I've been fighting it, I've been dealing with it for many, many years, and that led me to the men's group, which I joined later. But my journey also began when I worked for the late Finn Lykke. I was supposed to document the way we are killing seals, which led me to northern Greenland, where I lived with hunters. It also led me to a small island in between Siberia and Alaska, St. Paul Island in the Pribilov, where I met the local leaders who start talking about being colonized and having a colonized mind. And then shortly after, I joined the first talking circle, which it was like a gift from heaven. I didn't know that it was possible to talk about these issues in a forum where there's no prejudice. No one commented what I said. I just had the freedom to talk about what I've been through. But I have to wait, I think it was 6 years before the first group appeared in Nuuk. It was two psychologists who were looking for men with anger issues, with fear, so I joined it. The group was only living for 3 months, but these 3 months were so rewarding, so a couple of guys, including me, we decided to take the groups in our own hands, and that's what we did for 5 years. I took care of the Greenlandic-speaking groups every week, 4 times a month, 12 months a year in 5 years. And I think that's one of the most rewarding things I ever have done. Because there's no forum for men in Greenland to freely talk about anger issues, fear, shame. Usually it starts with when we have a newcomer, I used to ask them, tell me about last time you were angry, with your own words, what happened? And that's almost a start. And the first year, I think we made all the mistakes which can be made in a group. After a year, we discovered that to be in a group, you have to join us for 6 months. Because 3 months is not enough, excuse me. After 6 months, you start talking about what is difficult in a men's group, because you are in a group, you are secure. It takes time to building up security. So I think in these 5 years, we had 100 men through the groups we were running. And if there's any important experience from these years, it must be that these guys do not know anything about gender equality. Not because they do not understand it, it just doesn't exist for them. The guys attending us were young men, elders from all over the community. I was the Rector. We had a fisherman, carpenter, etc. We were very different. But we had this forum where it was free to talk about anger, fear, shame. Most of them had a violent past. But unfortunately, the society we have today in Greenland, and I think in many other places, we take care of the woman, of the girlfriend, of the wife and children first when there's a domestic violence or issues regarding anger in a family. But every time we are forgetting the one who probably is causing the turmoil, the domestic violence, is the man. The majority of men I've been dealing with are left back in the darkness with his anger, his shame. He has probably lost his wife, his children. There's no help to seek in the society. We were the last resort, or the last station, the last group they could attend. And that's what it did. So I think it is about time that we start facing that domestic violence is an issue we have to put focus on much more in order to create room, social security for those men who are in deep trouble. We cannot build up a society, secure society, if not we are dealing with it. Because what happens to them if we don't help them? Jack Hicks, he just mentioned they're committing suicide. They keep drinking, taking drugs. They have a dysfunctional life. It affects everybody. Not only the family, not only their jobs, it is the whole society. So I left my job as a deputy minister in May month because I couldn't see myself in a job anymore. Now I'm about to start new groups in Denmark because men's groups are needed, whether it is in Greenland, Denmark, Asia, no matter where in the world, because anchor is anchor. Where in the world you are, it doesn't matter. It's a basic human feeling. We men are very, very bad to start talking about anger, but this is a great opportunity to do it. It is in the men's group. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Gunn-Britt, Retter?
Thank you, Chair. Well, that is a hard act to follow. I think it was a very interesting to hear about your experiences with the men's group. My name is Gunn-Britt Retter. I'm the head of the Arctic Environmental Unit of the Saami Council. Saami Council is one of the 6 permanent participants to the Arctic Council that we were hearing about just in the previous, the keynote speech as well. So we are there trying to impact the security in the Arctic, I guess, through our participation in the Arctic Council. But Saami Council is much older than that. It's an organization that was established in the 50s, and the oldest still existing indigenous organization in the world, we like to claim. Well, first I want to comment on something in the previous session, just very briefly, because I'm sitting here with my national costume, and I heard an encouragement about reorienting national identity. And I have to add to that it's a bit hard when you are in a vulnerable, when you feel that your culture is vulnerable and might be even under threat of under threat for extinction. So it's challenging, a bit challenging to reorient the identity if you are in a minority position. And it's also difficult if the majority is the one that defines what that reoriented identity is supposed to be, just as a caution. That's why I'm wearing my national dress when I go to meetings. But this session is about human security, and I would like to focus here on food security. The Saami culture depends on healthy and productive ecosystems, and the change to these ecosystems will certainly impact the food production. And food security is, of course, as I see it, also a gender issue, and it impacts on various roles in the culture and the society. And it's about many things about food culture. I don't know if I have time to go into all of them, but the most obvious one, which has been mentioned already, is of course pollution. A lot of the pollution that comes from other places in the world are circulating around in the Arctic, and might, and it's of course first of all a threat for women and breastfeeding, and both women and men in reproductive age. So that is certainly a component to the security of the people and through the food sources. Another challenge is actually an example from my community or our region in Norway, where I'm based in northeast Norway. I think often food or access to food also impacts the mental well-being of people. If you are used to have access to certain kind of local food source over generations, and then you face regulations that is limiting the access to this food source, and you have actually a physical demand for a certain kind of food for a certain point of the year, and I'm here talking about salmon fishing in the fjords that we conduct in our region, which I know some Icelanders are opposing. A rich salmon fishing Icelander is opposing very, very hard that we are fishing in the sea. But the regulations that are forced or put onto people, and not only Saami but others as well, and when you are used to have access to a certain food source at a certain time of the year, and then you are asked to delay the start of the fishing 2 months, and limiting it to fishing it only for 4 weeks, 3 days a week, and there might be heavy winds, and we know everything about heavy winds in Akureyri and Iceland, I guess. You might not hardly have any access at all. And this is impacting, of course, the physical need for having access to salmon, actually traditionally already in May, but now it's limited to July. That is a very simple example on how regulations and national regulations where indigenous or local people is not able to impact how the management is forced on you in a way. And we have climate change, of course. We heard yesterday already some examples on how climate change can impact on the food sources, and flooding is one thing that we heard about yesterday, but of course the production in the ecosystems is another. I'm a coastal Saami, and recently Arctic Council has released reports on ocean acidification. That's also being something that will impact the production of all the fisheries that we depend upon. And also there are with food, and I guess many of you would know this. With food is a lot of, it's also culture and traditions, and we face as people in the Arctic many of the traditional ways of treating food or consuming food is by the food authorities at the national level often not looked upon as healthy, or it's actually looked upon as not conducted in a way that is healthy for people. But in fact, and well, that's why I guess France often get, what do you call it, they don't need to follow all the EU regulations because they claim that they have a food culture that is stronger than the EU regulations. But the Saami people, and I guess many other indigenous peoples, doesn't have that strong position within the state to claim our food cultures to be protected as food culture, but that rather that we face that the regulations are drawn upon your heads for our own security reasons. But I think the culture and traditions are a stronger component many times than the national food authorities' understanding of how food is. One maybe an international, or maybe at least in Nordic way of looking at this is the halal slaughtering. That is a very cultural way of slaughtering a sheep, or that certain people need to do to feel it's healthy for them. We actually already have some halal slaughtered reindeer in Norway to try to expand the market to also reach new markets. But there are many, could have been many examples on, for example, smoked meat and smoked fish is not looked upon as very healthy, but of course that is something which is very essential to the cultures and traditions and conservation of food. Maybe not so necessary today, but still it's good food, only that you don't need to eat it too much. So what I was trying to think, I was addressing that there is a lot of challenges with food security, and not to even mention all the challenges that we hear in the Arctic Council when we meet there about the situations in Canada and Alaska maybe even being more challenging than what we face in Scandinavia. Russia I know very little about. But what to do about it, I was trying to think, because I can't just sit here and complain about everything that is wrong. But I think it's important to raise awareness about the cultures and what is important for us, and what makes the communities resilient to climate changes and other changes, environmental changes. So to raise awareness, and that with the I need to say the Arctic Council is quite unique international fora, because of the permanent participants, the indigenous peoples organizations sit at the same table as the foreign ministers. So this is one venue that is very important for us, where we can address our challenges and try to even though it's soft law, but still we can raise our voice there and be, I don't know if you always impact the decisions or recommendations, but at least there is no decision or recommendations coming from Arctic Council without the states knowing how it will impact the indigenous peoples. But of course, I think also the knowledge that the people have, the traditional knowledge, needs to be utilized or used better in order to make the best possible recommendations for decisions. And of course, Arctic Council has called for that many times. What needs to be done is, of course, to mitigate the causes for climate change, which is to cut CO2 emissions, but we don't see too much of that happening yet. So that's why I'm bringing my own Guksi, so I at least can demonstrate some efforts to save at the personal level. Thank you.
Thank you. About how much time do we have? Maybe 10 minutes, okay. Okay, so thank you, panelists and speakers. So we began the panel, I'm just gonna give a quick summary with Gunhild, who sort of laid out the concept of security and how the narratives around that in the scholarly area is certainly quite exclusive, male-oriented, state-oriented, and that was then expanded by Valur, who talked about the different challenges being posed to this concept of security, and how there's, I guess, a lot of other narratives circulating out there that are disturbing this sort of state-centric rationalities of geopolitics, as he was saying. And he was talking a bit about the different actors and how different actors coalesce around these different concepts of security and their impacts on each other. Jack then gave us a very detailed, very poignant sort of look into this on the ground, as it were, in Nunavut, by looking at the social and the personal insecurity to some extent experienced in particular by youth in Nunavut and young men through the lens of suicide. And to some extent, this more look at the local and the personal was then picked up by both Søren and Gunn in their discussions, when Søren talking about the men's circle and the importance and the impact of that in the lives of men, and how little there is out there in terms of support for men struggling with things, and the impact of that struggle for wider society. And then, of course, Gunn talking about food security, and relating that in particular to indigenous peoples, and also the implications of histories of colonization and social and cultural dominance affecting that. So I really see a book here, an excellent panel, and I'd like to open up the floor to any questions there may be. Anyone? Yes.
Already. This is an amazing panel, so Koyanpak is thank you in my language, and I had talked to Søren previously, and he had asked me about my language, so quickly I'm going to introduce myself in my language. Uvanya Atiga Akpik, Charlene, Nupiak Siska Akpik, Anagaga Lorraine, Suli Anagaga, Sandra. So just briefly, I introduced my name. My English name is Charlene. My Nupiaq name is Akpik, which means salmonberry, and I listed my grandmother and my mother. So part of that is introducing yourself and where you are, because people share with you their experiences, and so you want to respond by reflecting who you are. So thank you to the panel, and I really think it's a really interesting how we saw with Jack's presentation all of the data and the numbers, and what does that mean though for on the ground, and what does that mean for the youth who reflect those numbers, and how do we take all of that data and make something of it to implement change? And I kind of saw that translated in Søren's presentation on what I really see as healing, and what we do to go back and look at those intergenerational historical traumas. And we have to take a step back and really start that healing process with young people and with men. And I just really think that's super important. And my question though, because a lot of the dialogue can be really heavy, especially around suicide and trauma, we often see presentations where we're left with a really negative perception of what's happening in Indigenous communities. But the conversation a lot of times doesn't highlight a lot of the strengths and the really cool stuff that's being done, like men's talking circles. And so, Jack, I was wondering if you could speak about the success of Quebec that you mentioned, that they had cut their suicide rates in half in that 10-year period, because part of self-determination is learning from one another and taking forums like this and implementing it in our own community development strategies, and really taking those positive things and doing something with it. So maybe you can, do you have information on maybe what Quebec is doing?
Happy to. So what Quebec has done is really just taken the international best practice and delivered it vigorously, which requires political leadership and mobilization of large numbers of people, high school teachers, college teachers, youth mental health, anti-stigma campaigns, suicide intervention training frontline workers to be more aware of what they might see, 247 helplines, all the stuff that there's already an existing evidence base for. They haven't broken any new ground. They've just done what the WHO recommends you do. They did it really, really well. And so, of course, for me, that raises the question, why in Nunavut has there been a focus on language camps and culture camps and all kinds of things which, to my way of thinking, can only be a good thing. Different people heal differently, and I'm in favor of all that stuff and a lot more of it, but there hasn't been the kind of work, the usual stuff. So it's suicide by Aboriginal people. It's quite odd. There's like this separate self-reinforcing literature that never gets cited in the international suicide prevention literature that assumes that suicide behavior among Indigenous peoples is fundamentally different than suicide behavior among non-Indigenous peoples, and that the way to address it is therefore fundamentally different. And I see no evidence base for this. My guess is that if Nunavut did the kind of things that Quebec has done, we would start to see a difference in time. And to take it a step further, if the Canadian government were to do the same sort of thing, including improving living conditions in those Aboriginal communities across the country which have elevated rates of suicide, which are not all Aboriginal communities. There's a huge variation in the suicide rate among Aboriginal communities. But if they actually strengthened services and did all the stuff that Quebec has done and improved living conditions, we would see a change across the country. But that would require leadership, and that would require public investment, and at least under the current federal government, that's not going to happen.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Any other questions? I have one question then for the panelists, which they can each answer in turn. Each of you present a really interesting case study and a problem, I guess, the issues that you see in the area that you spoke about. So if each of you could provide the audience, maybe if you could leave them with one central point about a way forward or a way through, or in terms of navigating through this towards a more positive or progressive future, what would it be? Anyone wish to start? Søren?
What keeps surprising me is that it's very seldom we ask the men or those in trouble, how can we help you? In the last 10 years, I've seen we can do this and this for them, but ask them directly, what can I do for you? It doesn't happen. It's very seldom it happens. And right now in Denmark, where I'm working, there's a unit called Greenlandic unit, where Greenlanders can talk about how to get social help, etc. And there's a program for them, etc. But I doubt that any of them have spoken with the Greenlanders and asked them, how can we help you? Do you want some help? So maybe it will be a very good idea to start talking with them, ask them, do you need any help? How can I help you? And for those who want to create a men's group, they have more than experience than maybe 2 or 3 psychologists about this issue. So helping them with establishing men's group, women's group, could be a very good idea.
Okay, thank you. Who'd like to go? Gunhild or? Yeah, sure.
Okay. So what I've presented today is more of a theoretical presentation, not concrete things happening on the ground. The reason is because language is important. Language has a lot of power. And this is what is interesting to me about what can be done with this concept called human security. It's a concept that's used in a lot of documents, not least like UN documents. I mean, you see it more and more used. It's not a dying concept. But people themselves, we don't go walking around going, well, this is an issue about my human security. And in a way, I'm almost thinking maybe we should. Because it's not the sort of language a lot of governments want us to be using, to be quite honest. It's not a popular term in Norway, in the governmental sector. It's not a popular term in Canada. You don't go talking about, well, my human security or our as a group. And by doing so, by using this language and saying, we're talking about our human security, this is something fundamental to our survival, which we need to see continuing. And I think everyone has been talking about certain issue areas that are fundamental to survival. They are, and not least, with regards to identity. It's a speech act, and it's a bit of a rebellious speech act. And it's not to take on the term human security as defined by others, as defined by northern governments or by northern governments, I mean like Canada and Norway, or by the UN, but to claim it and say that security is not the exclusive purview of the state. We want to challenge that purview, because when we don't challenge it, then in a way we accept that purview, and that the state will continue in the name of state security to take certain measures that actually influence human insecurity. So my takeaway then is think about the use of the language and the ways in which this could be used at the ground level to articulate those things that are fundamental to the survival of northern communities.
Okay, thanks. Valur?
So since you asked for a kind of a practical, progressive view on how things could be better, one thing comes to mind, many things actually, but one in particular, to democratize more the Arctic Council itself, and not make it, because it is basically an intergovernmental organization, although these treaties against oil spill prevention and about oil spill prevention and search and rescue, although these were Arctic Council initiatives, the treaties themselves are intergovernmental totally, and so it's about states really making all the decisions that matter in this matter. So I think more of the Arctic Council should be made more of a regional organization, and talking about security. Security should be openly discussed there, definitely in my view. And it has been a taboo since it was, although of course soft security is obviously on the agenda, considering these search and rescue agreement. But it has been a taboo to discuss military security in the Arctic Council since its inception, as a way also of weakening it. It was seen as a soft law and everything. So I think it's high time, particularly given what is happening now in international kind of politics, the moment there is a need to discuss these things, where some of the Western powers are there, and for example Russia as well. There's a need to discuss this thing seriously.
Okay, thank you. Gunn?
Thank you. Yeah, from the Saami people's point of view, I think we need to be better to promote our culture and our cultural products. That is gourmet food and the products that we can produce as an enrichment to the countries that we reside in. But in order to do this, we need to ensure that the basis for our culture, that is where the reindeer is feeding and where the fish is swimming, the access and the health of these ecosystems need to be ensured as well. And unfortunately, we are kept too busy addressing the access to land and waters and our rights. So it kind of takes off the resources from being better to promote the culture as an enrichment to the diversity of Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Russia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Jack, you have the last word.
There's a layer of, a small but growing layer of sometimes university-educated young parents in Nunavut who are coming to understand modern social change in Nunavut from a trauma perspective and coming to grips with where sharply elevated rates of child sexual abuse and sharply elevated rates of daily marijuana use among young teens, what that's rooted in, and why both levels of government have failed to provide people with adequate mental health care, a level of services that would not be acceptable elsewhere in Canada. And they see the way the North is being used by the federal government as a photo shoot that ignores the lived and died realities of people living there. I think you're going to see in the coming years a lot more focus on the question of, settling a land claim can bring you justice in a certain sense, but apparently it can also give you a government that's far too weak to address some of the biggest social challenges in the country. And there are increasingly tough questions being asked of both the older Inuit political leadership and the southern, the federal government and southern politicians. And that's where I see hope, is people who are not willing to accept the status quo, but have to figure out how to move forward.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank all of our speakers and panelists for a very interesting panel today. And now I think it is time for lunch. So thank you very much.